Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to go over the Principles of Democracy notes. So where do we find that? Well, on our homepage here, you can go to Modules, which is right here, or you can scroll down and go to Units and Modules here. And because this is the Principles of Democracy unit and the notes that we're going into, we're going to go into Principles of Democracy Unit 1. We're going to go to Resources here. So the notes that we're going to find for Principles of Democracy, the notes and the information that you'll need for this unit when we take our test at the end of our unit are going to be here where it says Principles of Democracy notes. So click on that and you'll get this nice color-coded set of notes and information. And I'm going to go through, and what I would suggest you do right now, or as you're listening to this, watching this, you have out a notebook or paper and you jot down some of the things that I go over. Or if you're somebody who likes to type things and likes things electronically, open up a Google Doc and you can either copy and paste this in there, or you can just simply jot down notes as you type as I talk. Whatever's going to be the best method for you to enrich these notes. So here we go. Principles of democracy. The word democracy is a Greek word and actually comes from two Greek words. Demos, which means people, and kratos, which means power. So quite literally, the word democracy means power is held by the people. And in a democracy, which we have in our country, the government should be limited by the people, meaning that it's our job as citizens to make sure that the government powers do not have too much power. And so when they created the framework for our government, which is in the US Constitution, which is why we're celebrating it today on Constitution Day, is it's set up to make sure that the government doesn't have too much power. So to protect people's right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, each of these 5 principles should be applied to successful democracies. And the goal here is to help out the common good, or in other words, the community, the mass of people, not just a small group. So our government is not supposed to just take care of the wealthy or just take care of the unwealthy. It's supposed to take care of the majority of people, the mass of people. So the first thing that is set up is this idea of popular sovereignty. So popular sovereignty literally means the people are in charge. Popular means people, and so in the word sovereignty, the word or the root word reign means to have power or to rule over something. So governments are only going to be successful if they give the people a chance to vote or give the people a voice. We're going to learn in our next unit about how the British government was not allowing its subjects or its citizens over here in America in the colonies to voice their opinions. So if something was going wrong, they couldn't really do anything about it. So in our country today, some examples of popular sovereignty, we have elections. We've got an election coming up this November 3rd, where we will be not only voting for a president, but we'll also be voting for some members of Congress, some members of the House of Representatives and the upper house, which is the Senate. We'll also be making local decisions within our state, within our county, within the city that we live in, and also sometimes within our school. Okay? Other examples of popular sovereignty or people having a choice or the opportunity to vote on things are included in the 9th Amendment, which we'll get to in our Constitution unit. But essentially, this means that anything that the federal government does not have the right to do, or that the state governments don't have the right to do, so if it's not a federal law or a state law, people can do whatever they want. So for example, last night, I shaved my head. Why? Because my hair was growing a little bit too long, and because I thought that this would look good. Now, that's a matter of opinion, but there's no law by the federal government, or there's no state law or city law that says I cannot shave my head. And so therefore, I'm exercising my right to pursuit of happiness and my right to life by basically going with what the 9th Amendment says, and I can make those choices on my own. There's also something in history called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which we'll get to later in the year. But when slavery was a hotbed issue, and some states said that slavery should be allowed, other states said that slavery should not be allowed, the government took it off their plate and said, we're going to allow the people in each state, or in these new states, Kansas and Nebraska, to vote on whether they wanted slavery or not. Now, fortunately, it was taken off the board by the 13th Amendment, but at that time, the government showed that they valued popular sovereignty and allowed the people to choose. Okay? Does anybody have any questions about popular sovereignty before we move forward? Okay. Then we'll go to representative government. So representative government goes right hand in hand with popular sovereignty. So if the people get to choose, not only can they choose the people who they want to serve in government, but sometimes they also get to choose which laws they want passed or which laws they want repealed or taken out. But representative government essentially means that we as individuals are not making all the choices in government, but we get to vote and elect the people who we want to make those choices for us. So think about it in your own life. When you need help with something, you can sometimes go to a representative. It might be a teacher, it might be a parent or family member, it might be an older brother or sister. But if you need something done and you can't do it yourself, typically you go to somebody, right? So that's what representative government is we use our right to popular sovereignty and the principle of popular sovereignty to vote and elect who we want to run the government or who we want to serve in government. So some examples, we'll get to this House of Burgesses in our next unit, but this was really the first example of representative government where the people in the Virginia colony wanted to have a group of people that got together and made choices for the rest of everybody in that particular town of Jamestown. So this was really the first example of it. Now, other examples, like I said before, we choose who we want to be our president. We choose who we want to serve our state in the Senate and also the House of Representatives. We can also choose who we want to serve as our governor for the state of Michigan. And you as students get to vote and choose representatives with your student council. So last year, some of you in here may have served on student council. You were a representative to the student body of your peers. Okay, so these are all examples of how we have representative government, not just in our society, but also as it relates to you as a student. Okay, and like I said, these two really go lock and step, hand in hand. We use our right to vote and have elections to help choose some of these representatives that we want. So think about representatives kind of like lawyers. If you or somebody you know has to go to court for something, God forbid, sometimes you'll want to have an attorney to represent you because they are better equipped and might be more knowledgeable of how to handle, how to answer certain questions, what sort of things to bring up, what sort of things you don't want to say. So members of government should work much the same way. Number 3, and this one's a big one, and this is a popular one because a lot of people sometimes have the misunderstanding that there are certain individuals above the law. So sometimes people think that President Trump or whoever's president, President Obama before him, President Bush before him, are above the law. They're not. Some people like to think that police are above the law. They're not. Some people like to think that they themselves are above the law. So it doesn't matter who you are, what position you have, how much money you have, how much authority you have. The Constitution is really the law of the land. So the rule of law basically means that everybody must follow the law and nobody is above it. And this is put in place because back in England in the, prior to the 16th century, there were kings who were basically just doing whatever they wanted and going rogue. And in some countries, dictators will do the same thing. So in a dictatorship, the dictator is the law and they can choose whatever they want to do, whether it's fair and just or not. So we have this set in place in a democracy because people should be accountable for their actions. And it would be scary if our president, whoever it might be, can just make whatever decision they want, can make whatever the law they want without consulting with anybody or without thinking about, is this fair and is this just for the people? So that's rule of law. Some examples, like we said, the president, representatives of government, or any government official can be impeached or removed from office if the charges that they're impeached on are bad enough and if it's decided that they should be taken out of their position. Also, another example of rule of law is states can't just go and make laws that go against the Constitution. So thankfully, the 13th Amendment has outlawed slavery, and that was in large part to President Lincoln after the Civil War. Shortly after that, there were southern states who still wanted to own slaves. Had they made a state law that said slavery is allowed.
Pardon the interruption. Cindy Larson, please dial 2704.
Sorry about that. Had they gone and made a law that said slavery would be allowed, rule of law would step in and say, nope, you can't do that. It's in the Constitution now, in the 13th Amendment, that says slavery in any form is not acceptable and will not be tolerated in this country. So regardless of how much money a state has, regardless of how much power a state might think they have, it's still not going to fly with that. Okay, Connor, you have a question.
So, you said about the Constitution, how, if, say these things...
All right, continuing on here, individual rights. This simply means that there are certain things that all people in society have a right to do. So you might have heard people say, these are my rights, or I'm within my rights, or my rights are being violated. So we all have the right to life, liberty, and property. All right. So that means I can choose what I want to do in my life, and I can't be arrested for it as long as I'm not breaking any laws. So again, shaving my head, I can't get arrested for shaving my head because it's not against the law. I have 2 tattoos. So if that's not against the law. However, what we need to understand is that that does not protect you against your place of employment, or like in your case, your parents. So as minors, you are not able to necessarily have all of your rights exercised until you become an adult at the age of 18. So if I, let's say, got a big ol' dragon tattoo on my side of my face, Mrs. Banks or Mrs. Comiskey or the superintendent might say, we have a problem with that, and we're going to ask that you either cover that up, or they might even say your job is in jeopardy. You should have asked before you got that. Even though that's my personal choice, there are some places of employment that have certain codes and restrictions and whatnot. So you always want to ask before you do it. But just what individual rights talks about is in terms of the law cannot prosecute you for doing certain things because you're within your rights. Okay. And we'll talk more about the Bill of Rights and these particular amendments in the Bill of Rights and how important they are and why they're important. We'll talk about Miranda rights. So when you, if you've ever seen a show where somebody's been arrested, the police are supposed to, by law, say your Miranda rights and tell you you have the right to remain silent. You're under arrest for this. If you say anything, it can be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. You have the right to a trial, things like that. Okay? So that's what we mean by individual rights. And notice here it says they're inalienable, which means they can't be taken away without good cause or without due process. All right. So if you break the law and you commit a crime, yes, some of your rights might be taken away because you have violated the law. But if there's no good reason to take away any of those rights, or if you are not given due process, meaning you have to have the chance to go to court, you have to have the chance to defend yourself, to explain yourself, to call witnesses, to have an attorney. If you're not given all that due process, then your rights can't be taken away. Okay. Any question on individual rights? All right, so we'll finish up here. Separation of powers and checks and balances. Now these two go together. So it looks like it's two things in one, and it is. But it basically means very rarely can one person or one group do a lot of things all equally well. So if you are on a sports team, or if you follow, sports, oftentimes there are multiple coaches, because one coach in charge of all those athletes and organizing things and being in charge of their safety, they can't do it all at once. So to separate their powers. So I think about it, I used to coach football, and I was in charge of coaching the defense, while someone else was in charge of coaching the offense. And somebody else was in charge of coaching the receivers, and somebody else was in charge of coaching the linebackers. It's to separate that power to make sure that things get done more efficiently. Now with that, there's also this idea of checks and balances. So applying this to government, our government is divided into 3 groups. So there's the legislative branch, which makes the laws. There's the executive branch, which enforces the laws, and the judicial branch, which determines if the laws are fair and just. And also they can look at it closer with a magnifying glass, so to speak, and determine if someone actually broke the law or if they didn't, if the police got it wrong. So, and with a system of checks and balances, what this means is if one group or one person is doing more than what they're supposed to, there's a check on their power, so somebody else can come in and say, no, that's not right. So a good example is if Congress writes a law and the president thinks this is not going to be good for the American people, I, as the president, am supposed to serve the American people. I'm going to veto this law and say, no, I'm not going to sign it and make it official. Okay. If the president decides he or she wants to declare war because somebody said something that hurt their feelings, and they're in a Twitter war with a dictator from another country, and they say, you know what? We've got more money. We've got more firepower. We're going to bomb you. We're going to attack you. Congress can pull the plug and say, no. We control the money. And in the Constitution, it says that all declarations of war must be approved by Congress. So presidents can say whatever they want, and they can threaten if they want to. It's not a good idea. But if they do, Congress can shut it down and say, nope, we're not going to approve this declaration of war. It's not good for the American people. We can talk it out and we can figure something out without violence. Okay. So those are just some examples of checks and balances. And to apply it to you as students, imagine if me, Mr. Chapman, said, you have 4 assignments to do today. You have until 2:30 to get all 4 done and everything else from the earlier part of the semester. And if it's not done, whatever's not done is an automatic 0. And if you have more than 2 missing assignments, you will be suspended for the next 2 weeks, meaning other issues. So imagine if I could make that rule and you went to Mrs. Banks and said, Mr. Chapman's making these unfair rules. And she said, sorry, there's nothing I can do. He's the teacher, he's the boss, it's his charge. We have that system of checks and balances here in our school and here in our district. So even if Mrs. Banks were to make a rule for the school that was not seen as justified or right, people could go to the superintendent or the school board, bring it to their attention, and they then would have the authority to come in and say, you know what, you may have wanted to do good, but this is not going to be good for the students, so we're going to change this and overrule you as a principal. Okay? So that's what we mean by checks and balances and separation of powers. So are there any questions about that last principle? Okay, and then the last thing to point out here is, in addition to these principles to guide our country, a successful democracy has to respect that there's diversity in the world. And the word diversity basically means there's differences. So look at the room around you, look at the world around you, and think about all the cool things that you have or the cool things that you want. And newsflash, they were not all invented or created or developed by the same type of person or the same gender of a person or the same culture person. All these great things that we have at our disposal were ideas that come from different races, genders, identities, backgrounds, wealth. So that's what we mean by diversity. So we should respect diversity and understand that it's good. Let's take the good things from all these different groups and apply that to our society, apply that to our government, apply that to our country, apply that to our world, and it will be a better place. Okay. So to sit and stare at a particular group of people and think that they don't have anything wealthy or anything good to contribute, it's couldn't be more false, because every nationality, every religion, every background has contributed something great to this world. And I don't just mean in history, it could have been just last week. In addition to that, there's this concept of patriotism. So if we want our democracy to succeed, if we want our country to succeed and continue to thrive and not be threatened by other countries, patriotism is basically showing loyalty to your country. Now, it doesn't mean you have to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. It doesn't mean that you have to stand for the national anthem. It doesn't mean you have to wave an American flag. It simply basically means you're making that pledge to say, I'm not going to hurt the United States of America. I'm not going to damage our country. I'm going to try and help our country and not get in its way. And there are some people who are just passive patriots. And what I mean by that is they simply say, I'm patriotic because I'm not getting in anybody's way and I'm not doing anything to make the country worse. Okay. So that's what we mean by patriotism. It's basically allowing the country to grow and prosper as it's good for the common good of the people. So